A flight attendant smashed a serving tray into a black teen's face, but seconds later, his father made a call that shut down the entire airline. What happened next will leave you speechless. He slammed a tray into a baby's face, certain no one would stand against him. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The tray rattled as the wheels clicked against the narrow aisle. Passengers leaned back slightly, folding in their elbows as the flight attendant maneuvered past. Dr. Malcolm Trenton, seated near the center of the cabin, shifted Isaiah in his arms, careful not to disturb the baby's shallow breathing. He lowered his voice, humming a soft tune, the kind of lullaby he often whispered during long nights at home. Yet even here, thousands of feet above the ground, his thoughts carried a quiet urgency. His only goal was to reach home without incident, to settle his son safely, and to prepare for the keynote address that awaited him. For now, nothing else mattered. The hum of the engines, the muted conversation of passengers, the faint clink of cutlery, it all blended into a fragile calm. But calmness often carries cracks, and cracks can shatter without warning. When Malcolm raised his eyes, he caught the attendant's stare. Victor Hale stood a few feet away, adjusting the cart with brisk mechanical movements. His smile was practiced, but it never reached his eyes. The gaze lingered too long on Malcolm, sharp, measuring, and edged with something unspoken. It was not admiration. It was not curiosity. It was disdain. Malcolm straightened slightly, instinctively pulling Isaiah closer. The baby stirred, a faint whimper breaking the steady rhythm of his breath. Malcolm shifted his weight, tucking the blanket more securely around the tiny shoulders. "Easy, Isaiah," he whispered, his tone patient, steady, filled with the same calm that had carried him through countless hours in the operating room. The child's fussing settled for a moment, though not completely. A restless undercurrent remained. Victor moved closer with the tray cart, stopping at the row behind Malcolm. He placed a meal on the tray table, but his movements were rougher than necessary. A glass clinked sharply against plastic, and the passenger flinched. Victor muttered a tight, "Sorry," before glancing back toward Malcolm. His jaw tightened. His hand lingered on the cart's handle, fingers flexing as if holding back words he could not yet release. Malcolm leaned forward slightly and raised his hand in a polite gesture. "Excuse me," he said evenly, his voice firm yet courteous. "Could I have a blanket for my son? He's feeling cold." Victor hesitated, staring at him without answering. The moment stretched thin, long enough for the nearby passenger to notice. Finally, Victor reached into the cart, pulling out a folded blanket. He placed it on Malcolm's tray table, not gently but with a controlled snap, as though the weight of fabric carried something heavier. "Here," he muttered, his voice low, nearly swallowed by the cabin noise. "Thank you," Malcolm replied, his tone measured. He unfolded the blanket carefully, wrapping it around Isaiah with precise, practiced hands. His movements were delicate but efficient, the instinct of a surgeon translated into fatherhood. Yet his eyes did not leave Victor, even as he tucked the edges beneath Isaiah's chin. He had seen that kind of stare before, in operating rooms when families doubted his skill, in boardrooms when officials questioned his presence, and in hallways when unspoken judgments hung in the air. He had learned long ago not to rise to it, not immediately. Still, the look carried weight, and Malcolm could feel it pressing down on the fragile calm. Victor forced a thin smile, one corner of his mouth lifting as though in mock civility. Then he pushed the cart forward, moving down the aisle. His voice drifted back in fragments, muffled but not entirely hidden. "Always the same. Entitled passengers." His tone was bitter, the words clipped with restrained venom. Malcolm's brow furrowed, but he said nothing. Instead, he looked at Isaiah, brushing a hand lightly across the baby's cheek. The child's fussing quieted into a softer whimper, then back into sleep. The rhythm of his breathing returned, fragile but steady. The cabin seemed colder. The air system hummed as always, but there was a chill that crept beyond temperature, the kind born not from machines, but from atmosphere. Passengers returned to their conversations, though a few cast curious glances toward Malcolm, sensing the subtle tension without fully understanding it. Malcolm exhaled slowly. He had been in far greater storms, both in the operating theater and in the public eye. This should have been nothing more than an inconvenience, a rude attendant, a moment of silent contempt, an incident to forget. But something in Victor's eyes told him this would not pass so easily. He shifted his focus inward, steadying himself. His objective was simple, and he clung to it like an anchor. Get Isaiah home. safe and unharmed. The keynote speech, the recognition, the responsibilities, all of it could wait. His son came first. But even as he rocked the child gently, humming again beneath his breath, he could not ignore the truth threading through the silence. The turbulence he felt tonight was not from the skies. It was from the man only a few feet away, the one whose mask had begun to crack. Sometimes the storm doesn't start outside. It starts within. Victor Hale's footsteps echoed faintly against the narrow galley floor as he pushed the meal service cart down the aisle. His jaw set, his lips pressed into a line that betrayed a storm brewing beneath his polished uniform. He moved with the rigid posture of a man determined to maintain control, yet the tremor in his hands betrayed his inner unrest. His eyes flicked toward Dr. Malcolm Trenton, seated near the middle of the cabin with his infant son nestled in his arms. The sight of Malcolm's calm patience, the way he hummed softly to soothe Isaiah's restless cries, only deepened the bitterness in Victor's chest. He bypassed Malcolm's row entirely when distributing drinks, the cart rolling past without pause, as though the surgeon and his child were invisible. A few passengers exchanged puzzled glances, whispering quietly, but no one spoke aloud. Malcolm noticed, of course. He had been trained to observe details others overlooked, tiny shifts in expression, the smallest hesitation in movement, and he saw the deliberate way Victor avoided his eyes. Still, Malcolm chose silence, focusing instead on his son. He rocked Isaiah gently, whispering words only the child could hear. His calm exterior masked the faint tightening of his jaw, the instinctive awareness that something darker than mere rudeness lingered here. The air around him seemed denser, charged with an unspoken tension that only sharpened with every passing moment. Victor leaned close to another attendant near the galley, his voice low but laced with contempt. "Crying kids and their self-important fathers," he muttered, his sneer curling into a thin smile. The attendant gave a nervous chuckle, shifting uncomfortably, but said nothing more. Victor's eyes remained fixed on Malcolm, cold and unyielding. To him, Malcolm was just another entitled passenger expecting deference, and the crying child was a reminder of the noise and inconvenience he despised. He did not see the reputation that stretched beyond the man's seat, the influence Malcolm carried, or the weight of his name in circles far larger than this narrow aisle. Passengers in nearby rows could feel the tension. A man across the aisle, older and sharp-eyed, raised his brow, his gaze shifting between Victor's stiff posture and Malcolm's calm silence. Something in Victor's stance, the tight grip on the cart handle, the faint twitch of his jaw, hinted at restrained aggression. The businessman watched carefully, sensing a storm about to break, but unwilling, perhaps unable, to intervene. Malcolm kissed Isaiah's forehead, whispering, "It's all right, son. Everything will be fine." His voice was steady, soothing, but his thoughts churned beneath the calm surface. He had seen storms begin this way, in operating rooms where pressure built before a sudden collapse, in boardrooms where arrogance cracked into disaster. And now, on this flight, he felt the same gathering weight. Victor paused near Malcolm's seat with the tray in his hands, the silverware rattling faintly against the metal surface as his fingers shook. His face tightened, distorted by quiet rage he could not quite mask. For a moment, his mask of professionalism slipped, revealing the darker resentment beneath. He turned sharply, retreating toward the galley, his shoulders stiff and his movements sharper than before. Inside the cramped galley, the hum of the aircraft seemed louder, a mechanical rhythm that pressed against his ears. Victor planted the tray down on the counter with more force than necessary, the clang echoing down the narrow aisle. He gripped its edge so tightly that his knuckles whitened, the veins in his forearms standing out under the strain. His reflection in the polished metal surface stared back at him, a face twisted with frustration, eyes burning with a hatred that seemed too large for the moment. Passengers nearby shifted uneasily, some glancing toward the galley where the sound had come from. Whispers rippled quietly, but the atmosphere of restraint held firm. No one moved. No one confronted him. Victor's lips parted, and the words spilled into the confined space, meant for no one but himself, yet heavy enough to hang in the air like a promise. "Let's see how special you are when the world sees you broken." His voice was low, almost a growl, vibrating with the intensity of the anger he carried. The tray rattled again under his tightening grip as he muttered with finality, his voice almost shaking with the force of the words. "The smallest crack in a mask can reveal the darkest storm." The breaking point arrived without warning. Malcolm had just leaned forward, his hands gently adjusting the soft blanket tucked around Isaiah's tiny body, when a sudden shadow cut across the aisle. Before he could even lift his head fully, Victor lunged forward, gripping the metal tray with both hands. The motion was swift, brutal, and deliberate. With a sickening crack, the hard edge of the tray slammed against Isaiah's fragile jaw. The sound echoed through the cabin like a thunderclap, a noise so unnatural and violent that it silenced every other sound for a split second. Then came the scream, Isaiah's high-pitched, piercing wail, so raw and agonized that it sent shivers down the spines of every passenger within earshot. His face crumpled in pain, swelling visibly before Malcolm's horrified eyes. For a moment, Malcolm froze. The world seemed to tilt, his breath caught between instinct and disbelief. His first thought was not rage, but fear, the sharp, trained calculation of a surgeon confronted with an emergency. His arms immediately wrapped around Isaiah, cradling the child against his chest. His fingers moved with desperate precision, checking for airway obstruction, scanning for blood, trying to determine whether his son could still breathe properly. The trembling in his hands betrayed the storm inside, a rare crack in the calm of a man who had steadied them countless times over open chests and beating hearts. Victor, however, did not retreat. His lips curled into something resembling satisfaction, his eyes glinting with a twisted pride. He muttered under his breath, though loud enough for nearby Rose to hear, "Should have kept him quiet." His voice carried a chilling calmness, as though what had just happened was justified, as though the suffering of a child was nothing more than the correction of a nuisance. Gasps erupted all around the cabin. A businessman in a navy suit leapt from his seat, pointing an accusing finger. "I saw it. He did it on purpose." His voice trembled with outrage, his face pale with shock. Another passenger fumbled with the in-seat phone, his hands shaking as he tried to alert the crew to call medical emergency services for landing. All the while, the rhythmic clicking of phones filled the air as passengers raised their cameras, capturing the horror in grainy video. Some shouted for help, others sobbed quietly, unable to believe what they had witnessed. Malcolm pressed a cold cloth from the service cart against Isaiah's swelling jaw, his every movement controlled, though his chest heaved with restrained fury. He whispered softly into his son's ear, words not so much for comfort as for strength. "Stay with me, Isaiah. Stay with me." His voice cracked on the edges, but his eyes burned like fire, locked on Victor, whose smirk betrayed no regret. The flight attendant's attempt to disguise the act as an accident came swiftly, though unconvincing. He raised his hands as if in mock defense. "It slipped," he said flatly, shrugging his shoulders as though the explanation should be enough to erase the brutality. But his face betrayed him, the tightness of his jaw, the flicker of contempt in his eyes, and that lingering sneer that the cameras had already caught. He was a man too sure of his protection, too confident that the power of a uniform would shield him. Passengers, however, were not so easily silenced. The businessman's voice rose again, this time stronger. "Don't you dare lie! I saw your face, you meant it!" He turned to Malcolm, his tone softer, laced with empathy. "Doctor, your boy needs help fast." The words pulled at Malcolm's focus, snapping him back from the razor's edge of fury to the clinical urgency of survival. He bent over Isaiah again, checking his breathing, counting the rise and fall of his chest. Relief flickered across his face when he confirmed the child was still breathing steadily, though shallowly. But the swelling was severe, the bone alignment distorted. The pain carved through Isaiah's cries, and every second felt like an eternity. Around them, the cabin shifted from shock to chaos. Some passengers demanded Victor be restrained, voices echoing in unison. "Tie him down. Get him away from the child." The calls were ignored by the other crew members who stood frozen, caught between loyalty to a colleague and the undeniable evidence glaring at them from dozens of raised cameras. The captain's voice crackled weakly over the intercom, urging calm, but his words dissolved against the tide of outrage. Victor, standing only feet away, folded his arms and leaned against the galley wall as though he were the victim of overreaction. His smirk faltered slightly under the barrage of angry stares, but he held his posture, clinging to a false sense of authority. The irony dripped heavy. He believed he had silenced a child, but what he had truly unleashed was a storm that would grow far beyond the walls of this cabin. Malcolm's silence in those moments was heavier than any shout. He did not raise his voice, did not plead or argue. His calm, his composure, even amidst his son's cries, unnerved Victor more than the passenger's anger. Because behind that silence lay something far greater than fury. It was calculation. Malcolm's mind, even as it trembled between father and surgeon, was already mapping the next steps. He knew this was more than violence. This was arrogance colliding with cruelty, and the consequences would not end with a bruised jaw. The man who had just struck his son had unknowingly struck at something far more dangerous: the reputation, the reach, and the will of a man who knew how to dismantle walls with precision. Passengers leaned closer to Malcolm, offering tissues, water, words of comfort. He accepted nothing, keeping his focus entirely on Isaiah, rocking him gently, whispering through clenched teeth as if speaking both to his son and to the man who had caused this nightmare. For the first time in years, his hands trembled, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of holding his son in pain, the knowledge that he had not been able to shield him from harm. His lips tightened, his jaw set with quiet rage as his gaze swept back toward Victor. He didn't just break a bone, he broke a wall he should never have touched. The cabin was no longer calm, it was fractured by panic. Passengers rose half out of their seats, voices clashing in alarm as Isaiah's piercing cries filled the air. "Restrain him! He attacked a child!" one man shouted from across the aisle, his face flushed with outrage. Another passenger, older and trembling, pointed directly at Victor, his voice cracking with anger. "That man should not be walking free after what he just did." The shouts ricocheted through the rows, but Victor stood rigid, his lips twisted into a smirk, a cruel satisfaction refusing to leave his face. His polished uniform and polished smile were gone. In their place was the arrogance of someone convinced he would face no consequence. The captain's voice soon cut through the chaos, calm but strained. "Please, everyone, return to your seats. We are handling the situation." But his words only fanned the fire. Passengers shouted back at him, accusing the crew of ignoring what had just happened. Malcolm, however, said nothing. He remained seated, his hands steady as they pressed a cold compress against Isaiah's swelling jaw. His silence seemed almost unnatural in the storm of outrage, a quiet so sharp that it drew glances from those nearest to him. Victor shifted uncomfortably, his smirk faltering for the first time. Cameras pointed at him from multiple directions, the red recording lights blinking like unblinking eyes of judgment. He tugged at his cuffs, straightened his tie, and leaned against the galley wall, projecting false calm. "It was turbulence," he muttered loudly, his voice strained. "A tragic accident, nothing more." But his explanation was met with gasps and laughter of disbelief. A young passenger near the aisle snapped, "We all saw you. Don't lie now. You did it on purpose." Still, the captain hesitated. He walked briskly down the aisle, his jaw clenched tight, and crouched near Malcolm. "Sir," he said, his voice measured, though a sheen of sweat betrayed his nerves, "please, I assure you this will be reported properly once we land. For now, I must ask for your cooperation. Let us handle this quietly." His hand hovered as if to reassure Malcolm with a pat on the arm, but he stopped himself, aware of the tension simmering in the cabin. Malcolm looked up, his eyes steady but unreadable. He gave a slow nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that he had heard. That silence carried a weight heavier than 1,000 accusations, and the captain faltered under it, quickly retreating to the front of the plane. The passengers, however, were not satisfied. "Quietly?" one man scoffed, his voice cutting through the cabin. "You think this can be brushed aside like nothing happened?" Another, holding his phone up high, shouted, "The world's already seeing this. Don't think you can cover it up." Through it all, Malcolm focused on his son, whispering steady reassurances into Isaiah's ear. "You're safe. I've got you," he murmured, his voice low, almost like a chant meant to ground himself as much as his child. His mind, though, was far from still. Behind his calm exterior, thoughts moved with the precision of a scalpel, sharp, deliberate, and exact. He recalled colleagues in law whose voices had brought corporations to their knees, allies in government who owed him favors, financiers who trusted his vision and influence. Each name surfaced like a chess piece in his mind, waiting to be placed. Victor, glancing nervously now at the murmuring crowd, seemed to sense that his confidence was slipping. "I told you, it was turbulence," he repeated louder, almost as if saying it again would make it true. But no one responded. Instead, passengers turned to Malcolm, their gazes filled with expectation. They had recognized him now. Whispers rippled through the rows about his name, his reputation, his standing. Some murmured that the man sitting there was no ordinary father, but someone whose reach stretched far beyond that cabin. Victor's smirk weakened further. the unease on his face betraying a truth he had not yet admitted to himself. This was not just an incident, but the beginning of something far larger. His every word, every twitch of arrogance was being recorded and preserved, waiting to be dissected later under lights far harsher than those of the plane. Still, he clung to his arrogance, adjusting his tie once more, eyes darting to the cockpit door as if it might shield him. The captain returned briefly, offering Malcolm another thin reassurance. "Sir, please, once we land, you can file an official complaint. We will cooperate fully." His voice trembled despite the rehearsed phrasing, his eyes begging Malcolm to accept the words as sufficient. Malcolm gave no answer beyond another slow nod, but the silence was suffocating. To those watching, his quiet carried more power than shouting ever could. A nearby passenger leaned toward another and whispered, "He hasn't said a word, but I swear it feels like he's planning something big." Dramatic irony swirled in the cabin. Victor thought he was shielded by the company. The captain thought shallow apologies could cover the wound, but neither understood that Malcolm's silence was not submission. It was preparation. Cradling Isaiah against his chest, Malcolm shifted slightly, lowering his face near his son's ear. His words were gentle, tender even, yet edged with a vow so sharp it cut through the quiet. "This pain will not be ignored. It will change everything." When the plane's wheels screeched against the runway, the chaos inside had not settled. It only shifted into something colder, sharper. The doors burst open, and security officers pushed their way aboard with medics trailing close behind. Passengers shouted over one another, voices filled with accusation and outrage, pointing toward Victor Hale as if trying to pin the guilt to his uniform. But Victor stood with his chin raised, shielded by two crew members who hurried him toward the exit, their eyes darting nervously at the cameras already flashing through the windows of the jet bridge. Malcolm Trenton barely registered any of it. His arms were wrapped protectively around his infant son, Isaiah, who whimpered weakly, his tiny jaw swollen and misaligned. A medic stepped forward quickly, urging Malcolm to hand the child over. With steady, deliberate movements, Malcolm surrendered Isaiah to the stretcher, his face a mask of control that concealed the storm boiling beneath. He followed close behind as the medics rushed through the terminal, his silence as heavy as the sound of Isaiah's muffled cries. The terminal was a wall of noise. Reporters, tipped off by frantic posts from passengers, were already gathered, cameras raised like weapons, shouting questions into the air. "Dr. Trenton, what happened on that flight? Is your son all right? Do you plan to press charges?" Their words battered against him, but Malcolm did not break stride. His eyes were fixed only on the fragile form of his son as the stretcher vanished through sliding doors toward the waiting ambulance. He entered with them, leaving the sea of flashing bulbs and chaotic voices behind. At the same time, the airline attempted to seize control of the story. A carefully worded statement echoed through the media channels. An unfortunate misunderstanding occurred due to turbulence. The words dripped with calculated detachment, as if they could erase the sight of a baby's broken jaw with corporate polish. Reporters repeated the line with disbelief, and passengers exiting the plane shook their heads angrily. The lie was so thin, so transparent, that it only sharpened the outrage. Inside the hospital, Malcolm stood at Isaiah's bedside as doctors confirmed the obvious. A fractured jaw, swelling that would take weeks to heal, and the risk of long-term complications. The boy lay sedated, a small bandage wrapped across his face. Malcolm's hand hovered near him, trembling for the first time in years. He was a man trained to perform under pressure, to cut and stitch lives back together, but standing here, powerless over his son's suffering, he felt a weight heavier than any scalpel had ever given him. "Malcolm!" A voice broke through his focus. It was Julian Ward, his lawyer, a tall man in a dark suit whose calm presence carried its own gravity. His reputation was that of a strategist who could reduce even the most powerful corporations to ash in the courtroom. He stepped into the room quietly, yet his eyes scanned the scene with precision. Isaiah's condition, Malcolm's expression, the tension coiled in the sterile air. Malcolm turned to him at last. His voice was low, stripped of any ornament or performance. "This isn't about one man losing control. It's about an entire system that allowed him to believe he could." Julian's jaw tightened, his hand slipping into his pocket as if steadying himself. "Then we won't just go after him. We'll go after every wall that sheltered him. But you need to be certain, Malcolm. This will not be a quick fight." Malcolm looked back at Isaiah, his son's chest rising and falling under sedation, and something in his gaze hardened. I've never started a fight I didn't intend to finish. While father and lawyer aligned their course across the city in the glass towers of Skyrise Airways, executives scrambled. Panic raced through conference rooms as emergency meetings were called. Orders were barked to public relations teams. Erase internal logs, contain witnesses, bury complaints. Every word spoken dripped with fear, not of guilt, but of exposure. They believed they still held control, that a few erasures, a few silenced voices would smother the fire. But cracks had already formed. Among the ranks of those ordered to delete and deny, one man faltered. A whistleblower, unnamed even among his colleagues, reached out quietly to Julian Ward. Within hours, confidential documents made their way into Julian's hands, records of repeated complaints, internal warnings about Victor's behavior, and clear evidence that the airline had chosen silence over accountability. Julian read the papers in silence, then slid them across the table to Malcolm. The surgeon studied them with the same precision he once used on an operating table. Every word was another stitch of truth, every signature another artery of corruption exposed. He set the papers down and exhaled slowly. They covered him for years, Julian said grimly. Passengers complained. Staff raised concerns. They silenced them all. Malcolm did not look surprised. Instead, he stepped toward the hospital bed, resting his hand gently beside Isaiah's bandaged face. The room was quiet but charged, the kind of silence that spoke louder than shouts. He lowered his head, whispering words only his son could hear, his voice steady with promise, each syllable carved from steel. He broke my son's jaw. Now I will break his empire. Passenger videos flooded the world within hours. Grainy footage captured the moment Victor's tray connected with Isaiah's jaw, the baby's anguished scream tearing through the cabin like a wound no one could unhear. Clips looped endlessly across social media, each replay of the strike amplifying public outrage. News anchors spoke with urgency. Protesters gathered outside Skyrise Airways offices holding placards with Isaiah's photograph, and hashtags calling for justice surged to the top of every platform. In city squares, in homes, in government halls, the name Victor Hale became a symbol of cruelty, and Skyrise Airways became synonymous with silence and denial. Yet, while the world roared, Malcolm Trenton remained publicly silent, his expression unreadable whenever cameras searched for him outside the hospital. Behind closed doors, however, silence did not mean surrender. In Julian Ward's office, the air was thick with strategy and fire. Papers covered the long oak table, medical reports, video transcripts, witness statements, all meticulously arranged by Julian's assistants. Malcolm sat at the far end, his hands folded, his gaze locked on the image of Isaiah's swollen face. He spoke in a voice measured but heavy. This cannot be just about Victor. If I strike at him alone, they will offer him up as a scapegoat, and the rod above him will survive untouched. Julian, leaning back in his chair, tapped a pen against his notepad, his sharp eyes gleaming with anticipation. Then, we don't just go after him. We go after the whole structure. Criminal charges against Victor, civil suits against Skyrise, and complaints to every regulatory board I can reach. They'll try to bury us in settlements. But if you're willing to refuse, if you're prepared to bleed this out in court, we can expose them. I didn't carry my son through this just to accept their money, Malcolm said quietly, the weight in his words pressing down on the room. His jaw tightened, and for a moment his surgical calm wavered into raw emotion. This is about principle, about every passenger they ignored, every complaint they silenced. Outside their walls, the airline's response came swiftly. Skyrise Airways issued its first official statement, cold and calculated. The act was framed as an unfortunate accident, a phrase that lit the public's fury like gasoline on open flames. Crowds grew outside their headquarters, voices chanting for accountability, banners waving with Isaiah's face and words like "Justice Now" painted in bold strokes. Yet, inside the skyscraper offices of Skyrise, executives sat in leather chairs, their faces pale but determined. They believed they could outlast the outrage cycle. They had survived scandals before, and in their arrogance they whispered to one another that silence and time would shield them again. But what they miscalculated was Malcolm's patience. His silence was not a retreat, but a blade being sharpened. Each day he visited Isaiah in the hospital, sitting by the small crib where his son lay, sedated, jaw bound in delicate bandages. He whispered softly, not for the cameras, not for the public, but for the boy who had unknowingly become the center of a storm. I won't let this end with an apology. Your pain will mean something. Late one night, after long hours spent drafting motions with Julian, a knock interrupted the rhythm of their planning. A man stood in the doorway, hesitant, his face pale with the kind of weariness that comes from secrets carried too long. He introduced himself quietly as Darius Holt, a mid-level manager within Skyrise Airways. His voice shook at first, but steadied as he placed a folder on the table. "You don't know me," he said, glancing nervously toward the window as though shadows might be listening. "But I can't stay quiet anymore. They knew about Victor. They knew for months, maybe years, and they chose to keep him." Julian leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he pulled the folder closer. Inside were internal memos, stamped and dated, detailing complaints lodged by passengers and crew alike, accounts of Victor's hostility, his aggression, even specific incidents where passengers had begged for intervention. Each memo bore a chillingly consistent response: silence, dismissal, or instructions to contain the matter discreetly. Malcolm read them slowly, his face unreadable but his grip tightening on the papers until his knuckles whitened. Darius continued, his voice hushed, as though confessing sins. They thought his record was too clean to tarnish. They wanted to avoid lawsuits, so they protected him. I was told to file complaints into the closed pile. I can't do this anymore, not after what happened to your son. The room grew heavy with revelation. Julian's expression hardened into focus, his strategist's mind already connecting dots and framing arguments. But Malcolm remained still, the weight of the truth pressing against his chest like lead. Victor was not a lone storm. He was a symptom, a face worn by a system that had chosen silence over justice. The man who had broken Isaiah's jaw had been shielded, even rewarded, by those who sat in boardrooms counting profit margins. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on Julian's wall. Malcolm finally set the papers down, his voice low but steady, the tone of a man who had held life and death in his hands and understood both intimately. "Then we uproot them," he said. "All of them. Every root, every branch, every rot they've hidden beneath their walls." Julian's lips curled into a faint smile, half admiration, half steel. "Then it begins." Malcolm lifted the memos once more, scanning them with eyes that no longer trembled but burned with clarity. In those lines of bureaucratic deceit, he saw not just the proof of corruption, but the map of an empire vulnerable to collapse. His silence broke only in a whisper, but the words carried the weight of inevitability. "We're not cutting off a branch, we're uprooting the entire tree." Court filings began under a cloud of hostility, and the battle lines were drawn not only in the courtroom but in the court of public opinion. Almost overnight, newspapers and online tabloids splashed headlines that painted Dr. Malcolm Trenton as the villain rather than the victim. Stories appeared claiming he was arrogant, entitled, and known for belittling service staff. Anonymous voices, some calling themselves insiders, others former patients, spoke with vague certainty describing him as a man who always expected special treatment. It was a smear campaign crafted with precision, and it landed like venom in the veins of public discourse. Yet beneath the noise, a countercurrent stirred, waiting to surface. The first cracks appeared when fellow passengers from the fateful flight came forward. Their statements, measured and sincere, carried a weight the tabloid fabrications could not rival. They described Malcolm's calm demeanor, his patience with the baby, and his composure even as tension simmered around him. "He didn't raise his voice once," one man wrote in a sworn declaration, but that attendant's anger was clear to anyone paying attention. The public began to question the airline's motives. Why were strangers who had been on the plane so consistent in their defense of Malcolm, while shadowy sources emerged conveniently in the airline's favor? Then came the blow that shattered the defense's illusion. Andre Vey, a quiet young man who had been seated a few rows from the galley, reached out to Julian Ward, Malcolm's attorney. Nervous but determined, Andre presented a short video recorded on his phone. The grainy clip showed Victor leaning toward another attendant, his voice low but sharp, the words unmistakable, "I'll shut that brat up." Though brief, the footage was devastating. There was no turbulence, no accident, no misunderstanding, just malice spoken aloud before the act. Julian wasted no time in verifying the clip's authenticity. When it was released, it spread like fire on dry grass. News outlets replayed the footage endlessly, commentators dissecting every word, every sneer, every flicker of intent in Victor's eyes. Social media exploded, and the smear campaign against Malcolm collapsed in real time. Even those who had doubted him found the evidence impossible to ignore. The irony was sharp. Skyrise Airways had tried to bury Malcolm under false accusations, but their own employee's voice rose from the shadows to condemn them. But victory was not without cost. The more the truth spread, the darker the shadows around Malcolm grew. One night, as he drove home from the hospital where Isaiah lay recovering, a black sedan followed him for several blocks, its headlights lingering in his rearview mirror. When he slowed, it slowed. When he turned, it turned. Only when he pulled into his gated driveway did it vanish into the night. The message was clear. He was being watched. Days later, anonymous calls began flooding his phone, voices distorted, warning him to drop the case before things became worse. Julian grew alarmed. "We need to get ahead of this," he urged during a late-night meeting in Malcolm's study. Papers covered the desk, medical charts beside legal briefs, a battlefield of two worlds colliding. "If we make a public statement now, while the video is fresh, we can control the narrative. You have the evidence, the passengers, the momentum. This is the moment to speak." His voice was steady but edged with urgency, his sharp eyes reflecting both strategy and concern. Malcolm listened, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The shadows under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion, but his gaze was unwavering. He thought of Isaiah, jaw wired shut, his cries muffled by pain. He thought of the countless people who would never have the platform he had, who would be silenced by fear or crushed by power. He shook his head slowly. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Every word I speak now will be measured against their noise. Let them shout. Let them smear. The longer I remain silent, the more their lies rot in the open air. When I finally speak, it will cut through everything and they won't be able to ignore it." Julian frowned but said nothing more, recognizing the resolve in his client's tone. Silence had become Malcolm's strategy, a weapon sharper than any press release. Yet silence also carried risk. Tension grew with every passing day, the media speculating, the airline doubling its efforts to distort the truth. Malcolm, however, did not waver. He moved through each day with surgical patience, letting the pressure build, knowing that timing would decide the scale of impact. At night, he sat at Isaiah's bedside, the boy's small frame dwarfed by hospital sheets. Machines hummed softly, steady rhythms that contrasted with the storm brewing outside. Malcolm brushed a hand gently over Isaiah's hair, his face carved with quiet determination. He whispered, not for the cameras, not for the courts, but for his son alone. The words were a promise, a vow, and a strategy all at once. Your silence is not weakness. It is the hammer waiting to fall. He broke a black infant's jaw and thought silence would protect him. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here. The gavel struck, and silence fell over the crowded courtroom as the battle began. The air was heavy with anticipation, every bench filled with spectators, journalists, and advocates waiting to see if justice would finally cut through the veil of power Skyrise Airways had wrapped itself in. At the defense table sat Lionel Creed, the airline's chosen champion, his reputation as a ruthless corporate attorney preceding him. Dressed immaculately in a gray suit, Creed leaned back in his chair with an expression of calm arrogance, as though he were already confident of victory. His sharp eyes scanned the room, resting briefly on Malcolm before flicking away, dismissive, as though the surgeon was just another obstacle to be crushed. From the very start, Creed's strategy was clear: intimidation. He rose smoothly to his feet, addressing the jury with a voice that carried both charm and menace. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not what it appears to be. You will come to see that what happened on that flight was nothing more than an unfortunate accident, distorted by emotion and amplified by media frenzy." He gestured toward Malcolm without directly looking at him, a subtle attempt to belittle his presence. "We cannot allow personal narratives to blind us from the truth." His words echoed in the courtroom, but the faint smirk on his lips betrayed the cold calculation beneath. Julian Ward, Malcolm's lawyer, sat calmly as Creed spoke, his hands folded neatly on the table. He knew the speech was meant to rattle, but his eyes remained steady, fixed on Creed as though studying an opponent under a surgeon's lamp. Beside him, Malcolm sat silently, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering. He did not react to Creed's barbs, did not allow anger to surface. Instead, his thoughts moved with precision, like instruments in an operating theater. He wasn't here to argue, he was here to dismantle. The prosecution began by introducing evidence that immediately drew gasps from the gallery. Internal communications from Skyrees were displayed on large screens, revealing that Victor Hale had been shielded after multiple passenger complaints. One message described an incident involving a disabled passenger months earlier, where Victor's dismissive treatment had left the traveler shaken. Instead of disciplinary action, the emails showed executives brushing the matter aside, citing potential legal complications. Each word on the screen was a blade, slicing away at the image Skyrees had built of professionalism and care. Creed attempted to recover, pacing confidently before the jury. Companies face complaints every day. Misunderstandings, exaggerations, none of this proves systemic failure. His voice was smooth, but Malcolm caught the faint tightening of Creed's jaw, the slight twitch in his hand as he gripped the lectern. The cracks were beginning to show. Then came the moment that shifted the atmosphere entirely. Julian rose from his seat, his expression calm but his eyes carrying quiet fire. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "we would like to submit into evidence a recording provided by Darius Holt, a mid-level manager within Skyrees Airways." At the mention of the name, the executives at the defense table shifted uneasily, whispering urgently among themselves. The judge gestured for the evidence to be played. The recording filled the courtroom with chilling clarity. A senior executive's voice echoed through the speakers. "Keep Victor on. We can't afford a lawsuit every time someone cries discrimination." The words hung in the air like a poisonous fog. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and even the judge's stern expression faltered for a moment before he composed himself. Skyrees' arrogance had been laid bare, transformed from whispers into undeniable truth. Victor Hale himself was brought to the witness stand. Dressed in a wrinkled suit, his once proud demeanor had withered into nervous sweat. His eyes darted around the courtroom as Julian's questions sliced into him. "Mr. Hale, did you strike Dr. Trenton's infant son with a meal tray?" Victor's voice trembled as he answered. It was instinct. The plane hit turbulence and Julian cut him off sharply, holding up a passenger video on the screen. "Was there turbulence here?" The video played in damning detail, showing Victor's steady stride, the deliberate swing of the tray, and the cruel sneer that followed. Victor's excuses collapsed one by one under the weight of testimony, video evidence, and the internal recordings. His hands twisted in his lap, his voice growing weaker with each denial dismantled. He tried again to justify himself, stammering, I thought I was controlling a situation." "You weren't controlling," Julian snapped, his voice cutting through the silence. "You were striking. You were protected by a system that told you no matter how you behaved, you would face no consequences." The jury leaned forward, their eyes locked on Victor's pale face, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to outrage. Skyrees' fortress of arrogance was no longer a shield, it had become a cage. Through it all, Malcolm sat in silence. His face betrayed no rage, no triumph, only the steady gaze of a man who had prepared for this moment with the patience of a surgeon and the resolve of a father. Every word spoken, every document revealed, every lie dismantled was not chance. It was precision. He understood that this battle was not about shouting the loudest, but about cutting with the sharpest scalpel, piece by piece, until the rot was exposed. The session drew to a close with the courtroom buzzing, journalists scribbling furiously and executives whispering in panic. Victor slumped in the witness chair, his credibility shredded. Creed sat stiffly, his confident mask slipping as he realized the case was sliding out of his control. Julian calmly gathered his papers while Malcolm remained still, his eyes fixed on the defense table. In the silence that followed, his thought cut through the noise like a blade. This was only the beginning. He leaned slightly toward Julian, his voice low but firm, meant only for those near him. "A tray broke my son's jaw, but truth will break your fortress." The retired pilot cleared his throat as he took the stand, his crisp uniform jacket neatly pressed, his silver hair combed back with practiced precision. The courtroom hushed, all eyes fixed on him as Lionel Creed, Skyrees' lead attorney, leaned in with calculated confidence. "Captain Howard Pierce," Creed announced, his voice firm, "you've flown countless routes over decades of service. Tell the court what you recall about Dr. Malcolm Trenton during your flights." Pierce adjusted his glasses, his tone measured but heavy with suggestion. "Yes," he began slowly, "I remember him well. He was hostile, arrogant, verbally abusive to the crew. On more than one occasion, he lashed out at staff when things didn't go his way. Frankly, I feared for the safety of those flights because of his temper. His words carried like a stone thrown into still water, ripples of doubt spreading across the room. For a moment, murmurs broke out among spectators, and even the jury exchanged uneasy glances. At the defense table, Malcolm sat perfectly still, his face composed, but Julian Ward's jaw tightened. The accusation landed like a carefully planted mine, designed to fracture the confidence of everyone who believed in Malcolm's integrity. Creed smirked faintly, sensing momentum shift. "And you're certain it was this man?" he pressed, pointing toward Malcolm with theatrical precision. "Without a doubt," Pierce replied firmly, his gaze unyielding. "I would never forget him." The silence that followed was tense, broken only by the scratching of pens across notepads. Then Julian rose with deliberate calm, carrying a folder in his hand. His footsteps echoed across the polished floor, a rhythm that demanded attention. He approached the witness stand and opened the folder with a controlled flick. "Captain Pierce," he said evenly, "you're a man of detail, aren't you? Someone who prides himself on memory and precision." Pierce straightened, sensing a trap but unwilling to falter. "That's correct." Julian slid a sheet onto the evidence screen, the large monitor glowing for all to see. "Tell me, Captain, do these flight logs look familiar?" He pointed at the dates meticulously highlighted. "According to Skyrise's own records, these flights you claim Dr. Trenton disrupted occurred on March 11th, April 22nd, and May 5th of last year. Is that correct?" "Yes," Pierce said slowly, his brow furrowing. "That sounds right?" Julian's eyes narrowed and his voice sharpened like a blade. "Then explain to the jury how Dr. Trenton managed to be on your aircraft on March 11th when he was in the middle of a 12-hour emergency heart surgery at St. Vincent's Medical Center. Or on April 22nd, when hospital records show he was performing a double transplant. Or on May 5th, when he was delivering a keynote lecture to the World Health Forum in Geneva, broadcast live." Gasps swept through the courtroom. Pierce's confident mask cracked, his lips parting as if words had suddenly deserted him. He stammered, eyes darting nervously toward Creed, who stiffened but tried to maintain composure. I must be mistaken. Perhaps it was someone else. Faces blur over the years." Julian leaned closer, his voice low but cutting. "Mistaken, Captain? Or bribed?" He held up another document. "Would you like to explain the bank transfers made to your account just 2 weeks before this trial began? Or the private correspondence offering you a consultancy position at Skyrise once you testified?" The retired pilot paled, his hands trembling as he fumbled for words. I needed the money. They said it would help my family." His voice collapsed into a whisper, the weight of his deceit dragging it down. The courtroom erupted, voices overlapping in outrage and shock. The judge banged his gavel for order, but the damage was done. Skyrise's credibility lay in ruins, their attempt at deception exposed in the harshest light. Malcolm remained seated, silent, his expression unreadable, though his eyes carried a quiet fire. Creed's composure fractured for the first time. His face flushed and his lips tightened as he struggled to regain control. But before he could pivot, another blow arrived. Word filtered through the courtroom in a hushed wave. Victor Hale, the very flight attendant at the heart of the case, had requested a private meeting with Julian. Later that evening, in a small, sterile conference room away from the noise of reporters, Victor sat across from Julian, his once arrogant posture diminished, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles white as if he were holding himself together by force. "They left me out to dry," he muttered, his voice brittle. "I did what they told me to do, what they encouraged. They said men like Trenton needed to be kept in check. They promised me protection, no matter what." Julian studied him carefully, his pen poised but his eyes searching. "Are you prepared to say this on record?" he asked quietly. Victor nodded, though his eyes brimmed with fear. "Yes, I'll testify. I'm not going down alone for them." The irony was almost unbearable. The man who had broken Isaiah's jaw, the enemy who embodied Skyrise's cruelty, had now become their undoing. When the news broke the next morning, it spread faster than fire in dry grass. Headlines blared across every screen. "Flight attendant turns against Skyrise." Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted completely. Reporters scribbled furiously, jurors leaned forward, and even the judge's face betrayed surprise. Malcolm sat in silence, leaning back slightly, his gaze steady on the collapsing fortress before him. He did not smile, but the sharpness in his eyes revealed everything. The airline's own weapon had turned inward, striking at its foundations. He exhaled slowly, his voice low but resonant, a statement that carried through the quiet tension of the room. Sometimes the walls don't fall from outside, they collapse when betrayal eats them within. The courtroom was heavy with silence when Victor's testimony concluded, his words turning like knives against the very company that once promised him protection. Executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their suits immaculate but their faces pale with unease. The air itself seemed to tighten, as though the walls of the chamber were leaning inward, pressing against the men who had built their careers on silence and denial. Papers rustled, pens tapped nervously, and outside the courthouse the muffled chants of protesters could be heard even through the thick stone walls. Placards bearing Isaiah's image, his tiny face still bandaged in photographs, were lifted high into the air. The voices of strangers demanding justice forming a chorus that seemed to seep into every corner of the trial. Inside, the judge's patience began to fray. He had once been cautious, careful not to lean too heavily toward either side, but Skyrise's evasions had worn him down. Each denial contradicted by a document, each excuse dismantled by a recording, had chipped away at the court's tolerance. He tapped his gavel sharply after another executive stammered through an explanation that dissolved into incoherence. "Enough," the judge said, his voice echoing across the chamber. His expression, hard and weary, was directed not at the witnesses, but at the attorneys who kept parading them forward like pawns. The message was clear. Their fortress of excuses was crumbling. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Malcolm Trenton rose from his seat, his tall frame steady, though the weight of memory pressed on him. The room, already tense, seemed to hold its breath. He walked to the witness stand without hurry, his steps deliberate, as if each one carried the gravity of all that had been lost. When he sat, he did not glance at the jury immediately. Instead, his eyes flickered to Isaiah's photograph displayed on the evidence board. His voice, when it came, was quiet but resolute. "I have held dying men in my hands and fought for every second of their lives," he said, his tone measured yet heavy with lived truth. "But nothing prepared me for hearing my son's jaw break because a man with authority believed he could get away with it." The words pierced the silence like a blade. Jurors leaned forward unconsciously, their pens still, their eyes locked on him. One juror, an older man with weathered hands, swallowed hard, his expression betraying the struggle to remain impartial. Reporters at the back scribbled furiously, every syllable of Malcolm's testimony destined to ignite headlines by evening. The prosecutors let his words stand unembellished, knowing no argument they could craft would carry the same weight. Malcolm recounted the strike itself with the clarity of a surgeon recalling a procedure, every detail etched into memory. He described the sound, the cries, the cold satisfaction on Victor's face, yet even in reliving it, he remained composed, his voice never rising in anger. It was this composure that unsettled the defense most, the calm strength of a man who did not seek sympathy, but justice. The airline's attorneys, sensing the tide shifting beyond their reach, scrambled. During a recess, they approached Julian Ward with an offer that gleamed with temptation. Millions in compensation, immediate settlement, confidentiality. In hushed tones, they painted it as mercy, a chance to spare Malcolm more public agony. But when the offer was laid before him, Malcolm barely glanced at the paperwork. His eyes, cold and unwavering, met theirs. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice carrying the steel of finality. "I want your walls torn down." The refusal echoed far beyond the negotiation room. News of his rejection spread quickly, and by the time court reconvened, the protests outside had swelled. The chants grew louder, their rhythm pounding like a drumbeat of resistance. Inside, the executives looked smaller than ever, their empire shrinking with each passing moment. Back in the courtroom, Malcolm's testimony continued to ripple outward, his words replaying in the minds of those who listened. Dramatic irony hung in the air like a storm cloud. Skyrise had assumed he was a man who wanted compensation, a settlement to quiet his outrage. They believed he would trade silence for wealth. Yet before their eyes, he revealed himself not as a petitioner, but as a force of reckoning. As Malcolm stepped down from the stand, he did not look back at the defense table, nor at Victor, who sat hollow-eyed after turning against his former masters. Instead, he moved through the courtroom with the unhurried calm of a man who knew exactly what storm he carried within. He walked out of the courtroom that day not just a surgeon, not just a father, but a storm. "You mistook me for a complaint. I am the verdict." The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces unreadable, the weight of 6 long weeks pressing on their shoulders. The air felt heavy, as though everyone inside was holding the same collective breath. The foreman rose slowly, paper trembling slightly in his hand, though his voice rang steady when he spoke. "We, the jury, find Skyrise Airways guilty of criminal negligence, willful misconduct, and corporate liability." The words sliced through the silence like a blade, and the room erupted in gasps. The tension that had lingered for weeks burst into a storm of whispers, hurried scribbling of reporters' pens, and the clicking of cameras trying to capture every flicker of expression. Executives in tailored suits slumped in their seats, their once confident faces now pale, their eyes darting like cornered animals. The gavel struck, calling for order, but the noise could not be stilled. The foreman continued reading, his tone grim but resolute. "The airline shall pay damages unprecedented in scale, compensating not only the direct victims but also establishing funds for future passenger protection." Each line carried a weight that bore down on the company's representatives like stones stacking higher on their backs. The judge, his expression carved in solemnity, leaned forward and delivered the words that would shatter the room. "In light of overwhelming evidence of systemic corruption and abuse, Skyrise Airways' operating license is hereby suspended, pending full restructuring under federal oversight." For a heartbeat, the courtroom froze, a vacuum of disbelief pulling everyone into silence. Then, as though the air had snapped, gasps and cries rippled through the crowd. Reporters rushed toward the doors, eager to deliver the breaking news. Executives dropped their gazes to the floor, their defeat painted across their faces, while some clutched briefcases as if they could hold on to the remnants of their empire. Victor Hale, the man whose strike had sparked this storm, stood apart. He avoided the eyes of those around him, his posture hunched, his once smug demeanor now stripped bare. He had been sentenced separately, his punishment softened by his late testimony, yet he was marked forever as the disgraced figure who betrayed both a passenger and his employer. Whispers trailed after him, not of sympathy, but of disdain. His betrayal of the airline had been the final crack in its armor, and though it saved him from life behind bars, it ensured he would never escape the shadow of his actions. At the center of it all sat Malcolm Trenton, calm yet unyielding, his son Isaiah nestled gently in his arms. The boy's jaw was still healing, bandaged but stable, a quiet symbol of the ordeal that had brought this giant to its knees. Malcolm did not smile or gloat. His face was steady, his eyes fixed forward as though already looking beyond the moment to the work yet to be done. Inside him, there was no triumph of ego, only the gravity of what had been accomplished and what it meant for others who had once suffered in silence. Outside, the sound of the crowd swelled, their chants seeping through the courthouse walls. "Justice for Isaiah! Justice for Malcolm!" Men and women held signs with the child's photo, his tiny, swollen face becoming an emblem of resistance and change. The cheers carried with them a sense of vindication, of hope that something had shifted in the balance of power between ordinary people and those who thought themselves untouchable. Julian Ward, standing beside Malcolm, leaned close and whispered, "This is bigger than us now. You've changed the ground they walk on." His voice carried admiration, but also the recognition of responsibility. Malcolm only nodded, his mind sharp with understanding. He had not fought for applause, nor for wealth, but for the dismantling of arrogance that had stood unchecked for too long. The irony of it all weighed heavy in the air. The airline had believed they could reduce a brutal act to paperwork, settle it with hush money, and move on. They thought Malcolm's silence would fade into the noise of other scandals. Instead, his silence had become a sharpened weapon, and when he finally spoke, it brought down an empire. What they mistook as a complaint had transformed into a reckoning that would be remembered long after their name had been scraped from planes and terminals. As the courtroom emptied, Malcolm rose slowly, clutching Isaiah against his chest. His son stirred faintly, his small hand brushing against his father's coat, a reminder of why this battle had been fought. Reporters shouted his name, cameras flashed, but Malcolm did not break stride. He walked through the hall with measured steps, every click of his shoes echoing against marble floors, each one sounding like the toll of a bell for the fallen airline. Outside, the sunlight struck his face, and for a brief moment the crowd quieted, as if waiting for him to speak. But Malcolm did not address them. He simply looked at Isaiah, then at the courthouse behind him, its steps filled with men chanting for justice, and he understood the deeper truth. His fight had been for his son, but its victory now belonged to countless others. Skyrise Airways was no longer a titan of the skies. It was a caution etched into history. And as Malcolm descended the steps with calm dignity, the final words of the day lingered, not spoken aloud but carved into the hearts of all who witnessed it. What was once a name in the sky is now a warning carved into the ground. The collapse began not with a whisper, but with a crash loud enough to shake the entire corporate world. Within hours of the verdict, Skyrise Airways stock plunged in freefall, numbers bleeding red across trading screens. Reporters camped outside the airline's glass towers, capturing images of employees rushing out with boxes of personal belongings. Investors abandoned ship, boards of directors held frantic midnight calls, and the name Skyrise became shorthand for arrogance and ruin. What had once been a giant in the skies now staggered like a wounded beast, its every step shadowed by scandal. Yet, while the public fixated on the airline's downfall, Malcolm Trenton stood apart, his gaze fixed on something higher. He was not interested in gloating or feeding off Skyrise's humiliation. Revenge, to him, had always been a hollow prize. What mattered was transformation. In the quiet of his office, dim light falling across stacks of legal drafts and witness statements, Malcolm made a decision that would define his legacy. From the settlement awarded to him, he would build something greater. A foundation that would not just punish one corrupt company, but shield passengers everywhere from the abuse of unchecked power. He called it the Isaiah Foundation. The name alone carried a weight that silenced rooms when spoken aloud. At the first meeting in a modest rented hall, Malcolm outlined his vision. "We will fight for those who have no voice," he said, his tone steady, his hand resting lightly on a folder thick with reports. His eyes, however, betrayed the fire beneath his calm exterior. "What happened to my son was not an accident. It was the result of arrogance, of a culture that believed lives could be disregarded. That culture will end here." Julian Ward sat beside him, his sharp features unreadable until a rare smile tugged at his lips. A man who had built his career tearing apart corporate lies, Julian had seen countless victims crushed by the weight of companies like Skyrise. Yet something in Malcolm's vision stirred even his seasoned heart. "You'll need someone to fight in the trenches," Julian said, folding his arms across his chest. His voice carried the grit of a man who had lived in courtrooms. "If you're serious about this, I'll be your strategist. We'll make sure no voice gets buried again." The foundation quickly grew from an idea into a force. Whistleblowers from across industries, airlines, railways, even private security firms reached out in secret, handing over documents, recordings, and testimonies. Many of them had been silenced before, threatened into submission. Now, with the Isaiah Foundation offering protection, their words became weapons. In long hours that stretched into nights, Malcolm and Julian sifted through these accounts. Some were heartbreaking stories of injury, others were tales of intimidation, all carrying the same theme: power abused, people ignored. Meanwhile, Skyrise executives found themselves dragged into federal hearings, seated beneath bright lights that seemed to strip away every pretense of innocence. Senators demanded answers. How many complaints were buried? How many voices were silenced? One thundered across the chamber. The executives fumbled with rehearsed statements, but each denial only sharpened the humiliation. Cameras rolled as transcripts of covered-up reports were read aloud, and the nation watched the empire that had flown too high crumble under its own corruption. Malcolm never stepped into those hearings to gloat. Instead, he watched from a distance, his presence known but never flaunted. He had no need to revel in their downfall. The truth was punishment enough. In private moments, though, the weight pressed on him. Late at night, when the city fell silent, he sat at his desk, staring at Isaiah's medical reports. He thought of the night in the cabin, of the silence that followed the blow, and of the choice he made not to let anger consume him, but to turn it into change. The irony struck everyone who followed the story. The airline had believed silencing a crying baby would restore order, that one act of cruelty could be buried beneath corporate spin. Instead, that single cry had grown into a roar that dismantled an empire. Protesters who once chanted outside the courthouse now stood outside Skyrise's empty headquarters, carrying signs that read, "We are all Isaiah." At home, Isaiah began to smile again, his jaw slowly healing, the wires finally removed. Each time Malcolm saw that small grin return, a measure of his burden lifted. He would sit by his son's bed at night, the glow of the city lights slipping through the curtains, and lean close enough for only Isaiah to hear. His voice was gentle, carrying both pride and sorrow, but also hope for what lay ahead. Your pain gave the voiceless a weapon. Malcolm's footsteps echoed softly across the polished marble floor as he entered the newly renovated terminal, a place that once bore the insignia of Skyrise Airways but now stood stripped of its old identity. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and new carpet, the scent of change lingering in every corner. Where once hung the arrogant golden wings of the disgraced airline, there were now simple banners carrying the rebranded name under new ownership, their muted colors symbolizing humility rather than pride. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the scene before him. Uniformed crew members gathered in clusters, not for flight preparations, but for training. He watched as they practiced role-play exercises, attendants kneeling down to eye level with mock passengers, listening intently, their responses measured with respect. The sight was a quiet reassurance that the work he had begun through the Isaiah Foundation was no longer just theory, it was becoming reality. A young attendant stumbled slightly during one exercise, fumbling over words when asked to comfort a frustrated traveler. The instructor, a senior man with a calm presence, corrected him gently. Respect is not about words alone. It is in how you stand, how you listen, how you carry yourself. Malcolm felt a faint warmth stir within him. It was proof that the system was learning, even if slowly. Yet beneath that pride lingered the weight of constant vigilance. For every step forward, shadows lingered behind him. As he walked through the terminal, the flash of cameras from a distance reminded him that his presence rarely went unnoticed. Protesters who once cheered his victories were now joined by critics who called him dangerous, accusing him of destabilizing industries and threatening livelihoods. Anonymous threats arrived in letters, in messages slipped beneath his office door, and sometimes through late-night calls filled with silence. He had grown accustomed to the unease, but it never fully left him. Julian often urged him to take more security, but Malcolm refused to live like a man barricaded from the world. His duty was to face it, not hide. Later that afternoon, Malcolm sat in a quiet conference room overlooking the runway, a folder of court documents open before him. The skyline stretched across the windows, planes taking off and landing like distant birds. Julian entered, his face taut with the exhaustion of constant legal battles. He dropped a file onto the table with a sigh. "Another summons. They want you to testify again, this time in a corporate oversight hearing," he said, his tone flat but edged with respect. "They won't stop calling you." Malcolm leaned back, his expression calm but his eyes heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. "Then I won't stop answering," he replied. His voice was steady, but his hand, resting against the glass of the table, betrayed the faint tremor of weariness. Silence followed, broken only by the muted sound of a departing aircraft outside. As dusk fell, Malcolm returned to the training hall drawn by the sound of voices. He stood quietly at the back as a group of attendants recited the Foundation's new code of conduct. Their words carried conviction, but Malcolm knew conviction was tested not in training rooms, but in moments of pressure thousands of feet above the ground. He could not stay to ensure every rule was followed, but his role was to build a system strong enough to stand without him. The tension of his journey reached a peak days later when he received a letter sealed with the insignia of the national government. The envelope felt heavier than its weight suggested. Inside, the words were formal yet direct. He was invited to chair a newly formed national task force on passenger safety and corporate accountability. For a moment, Malcolm simply stared at the page, his breath held. He thought back to the flight that began everything, when he had boarded only as a father seeking peace. Now, fate demanded he become something larger, a voice that could reshape an entire industry. That night, Julian joined him in his study, the letter spread between them. "This will not be easy," Julian said, his brow furrowed. "Every decision you make will be under fire. Every reform will be resisted." Malcolm nodded slowly, his gaze turning toward the city lights outside. His reflection stared back at him in the window, tired, scarred, but unbroken. "Change never comes easy," he said softly. "But if we don't carry it, who will? The room fell silent again, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of history, of pain transformed into purpose. The future stretched before him, uncertain but undeniable. The man who once sought nothing more than to bring his son home safely had become the architect of something far greater. He returned once more to the terminal, standing at the center of the bustling concourse. Travelers hurried past, unaware of the man who now shaped the path of their journeys. He watched the attendants, the staff, the subtle shifts in tone and posture, and knew the struggle was worth every sleepless night. In the quiet of that moment, he reflected not on the threats nor the endless hearings, but on the simple truth that one act of cruelty had ignited a movement. His hand rested lightly on the strap of his bag as he whispered the words to himself, the words that would carry him forward. What began as one broken jaw became the blueprint for breaking chains. A year after the incident, Malcolm stood at the wide entrance of the Isaiah Foundation's newly completed headquarters, a towering glass building that gleamed beneath the pale morning sun. The structure rose like a monument of resilience, its transparent walls reflecting both the city skyline and the faces of those gathering below. Banners stretched across the entrance with the Foundation's name written boldly, a declaration that what began in silence now had a voice too powerful to ignore. Crowds assembled on the plaza, their voices a low murmur of anticipation. Leaders, activists, and survivors of corporate neglect stood shoulder to shoulder, united not by wealth or influence but by scars and stories. Cameras flashed in rhythmic bursts, filling the air with a restless energy, while the faint hum of reporters' microphones captured every breath of the unfolding moment. At Malcolm's side toddled Isaiah, his small steps unsteady but full of life. The boy's laughter echoed softly, innocent and free of the memory that had scarred his early years. He reached for Malcolm's hand, tugging at his father's sleeve as though urging him forward. Malcolm looked down, his lips curving into a brief smile that carried both relief and sorrow. The scar on Isaiah's jaw was faint but visible, a reminder that healing left marks no eye could completely erase. In that moment, Malcolm's mind wavered between pride in his son's resilience and the weight of the journey that had led them both here. The air shifted when Malcolm stepped up to the podium. Conversations faded, replaced by silence so heavy that even the clicking of cameras seemed distant. He adjusted the microphone, his tall frame casting a commanding presence against the glass facade behind him. His voice, steady yet edged with unshaken conviction, carried into the expectant crowd. They thought one act of cruelty would silence us. Instead, it awakened a chorus the world could not ignore. The words ignited the audience. Applause roared across the plaza, rising like a wave, echoing off the steel and glass towers. Yet Malcolm's expression did not waver into triumph. His gaze remained steady, fixed not on the cheering crowd but on the horizon, as though searching for shadows beyond the light. He knew too well that victory was never permanent. For every injustice dismantled, another would rise. Behind the applause was an unspoken truth. His fight was not finished. He could already feel the burden of future battles pressing against his shoulders, demanding vigilance and resolve. Julian Ward, his trusted ally and now the Foundation's chief legal strategist, stood a few paces away, his arms folded tightly across his chest. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, not for admiration, but for threats, knowing Malcolm's defiance had earned as many enemies as it had allies. When Malcolm stepped down from the podium, Julian leaned closer, his voice low. "You've built more than a foundation here. You've built a mirror, and mirrors have a way of forcing people to see what they'd rather ignore." Malcolm nodded, his jaw tightening. "That's what frightens them most. Not me, what I represent." His tone carried no pride, only a solemn recognition of the path he had chosen. He clasped Isaiah's hand again, grounding himself in the boy's warmth as they walked through the cheering crowd, every step a reminder that his personal pain had been transformed into public purpose. The day stretched on with handshakes, photographs, and quiet conversations. Survivors shared their stories with trembling voices, some thanking Malcolm with tears in their eyes, others simply nodding in gratitude, unable to put their emotions into words. Each encounter deepened Malcolm's resolve, but also weighed on him, the reminder that every scar, every tear, was now a responsibility on his shoulders. As dusk settled, the plaza cleared, the building's glass walls glowing gold in the fading light. That night, when silence finally returned to his home, Malcolm found himself seated at his desk, Isaiah asleep in the next room. He opened the stack of letters that had been delivered with the day's speeches and accolades, his tired hands brushing over envelopes filled with stories of pain, resilience, and hope. One letter in particular drew his attention. Its paper was worn, its words written in careful but shaky handwriting. "Dear Doctor, Trenton," it began, "I am a father from across the ocean. A year ago, I lost hope when my own child was hurt by those who believed their power made them untouchable. When I read about your fight, I found the courage to stand against them. I challenged a corrupt bus company that thought no one would dare oppose them. I would have remained silent if not for you. Because of your voice, mine was heard. Thank you." Malcolm sat back, the words sinking deep into his chest. He imagined this unknown father, somewhere far away, holding his own child close, fueled by the same fire that had driven him through the darkest nights. The ripple of one act, once contained to the aisle of a plane, had crossed borders and ignited courage in places Malcolm had never touched. It was both humbling and daunting to realize the weight of such influence. He rose quietly and stepped into Isaiah's room. The boy slept peacefully, his breath slow and even, the faint scar along his jaw barely visible in the dim light. Malcolm stood over him, his hand resting on the crib, his heart caught between sorrow and hope. He whispered into the stillness, his voice carrying the words that now defined everything, the past, the present, and the promise of what lay ahead. A jaw was broken, but a generation was healed. Seconds later, the father shut down more than the flight, he shut down the entire airline. If you stand for protecting the innocent and real accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of racism, abuse of authority, and the consequences of unchecked aggression in public spaces. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic discrimination, provoke thought on accountability, and inspire action toward justice and respect for human dignity.